The morning Hazel Whitaker was thrown out of her grandmother's house, the temperature in Briar Hollow, West Virginia had already dropped below freezing, and the first hard frost of 1937 was silvering the dead grass along the road. She stood on the porch with a flour sack holding everything she owned: two faded dresses, a wool blanket eaten through by moths in 3 places, a copy of Practical Botany for Rural Schools she had taken from the library 2 years before, and never returned because nobody else in the county had ever asked for it. A folded photograph of her mother standing in a vegetable garden, smiling at someone the camera could not see. Behind her, the screen door slammed. The bolt slid home with a sound like a coffin lid closing. "Don't you come back here, child," her grandmother's voice called through the wood. The voice was thin. The voice was tired. The voice was breaking, but it was holding. "I won't have a thief under this roof." Hazel did not turn around. She had not stolen anything, not so much as a peppermint stick from the jar at the cash register. What she had done was worse than stealing in the eyes of Briar Hollow. She had embarrassed Edgar Crowder, the only son of Roland Crowder, the man who owned the general store and the coal company office and most of the rental houses along the creek, including the one her grandmother lived in for $2 a month. Hazel adjusted the flour sack on her shoulder. The frost crunched under her one decent pair of boots. Somewhere down the hollow, a rooster was calling at the gray sky. Somewhere up on the ridge, a dog was answering it. The world was waking up around her like nothing at all had changed, and that was the cruelest part. The world did not stop. The world did not even slow down. She walked down the porch steps. She walked through the gate. She walked past the slumping fence post where her grandfather had nailed a horseshoe for luck, the year before he died of black lung. She did not look back at the house once. If she had looked back, she would have seen her grandmother's face pressed against the kitchen window. She would have seen the tears running down the deep grooves of that old face. She would have seen the hand pressed flat against the glass, fingers spread wide as though her grandmother were trying to push something through to her, something that could not be said out loud while there were still ears in this hollow that belonged to the Crowder family. But Hazel did not look back. She had learned in 16 years of being who she was that looking back did not change the temperature or fill the stomach. And she had never been a girl who spent energy on things that did not work. She turned at the road and went west. To understand why a 16-year-old girl could walk away from the only home she had without crying, you have to understand what had been taken from her already, piece by piece, year by year, until there was almost nothing left to take. Her mother had died of typhoid in the summer of 1930. Hazel had been 9 years old. She remembered the way the fever had turned her mother's beautiful brown hair dark with sweat against the pillow. She remembered the way her mother had held her hand on the last morning and said, "You are smarter than this town, baby girl. Don't you ever forget that. Smarter than this town." Her father had buried his wife on a Tuesday and gone north on a Thursday looking for work in the steel mills outside Pittsburgh. He had promised to send for Hazel as soon as he had a room. The first letter came in October with $3 folded inside it. The second letter came at Christmas with a small wooden bird he had carved during his lunch breaks. The third letter never came. Hazel waited a year. Then she stopped waiting. Her grandmother Vesta took her in. Vesta Whitaker was 61 years old that summer, already coughing through the nights with the rattle that meant her own husband's lungs had passed down to her, by way of the coal dust she had washed out of his clothes for 43 years. Vesta had nothing. Vesta lived on what the church ladies brought, and what the small garden behind the rental house produced, and the $2 a month from a war widow's pension that Roland Crowder somehow always took back through one fee or another at the company store. Hazel learned to do the washing. Hazel learned to tend the garden. Hazel learned to carry water from the spring before sunrise so her grandmother would not have to bend over the bucket with that terrible cough. Hazel learned to read at school during the day and to read at night by the light of a single tallow candle, working her way through every book in the small library above the post office, one at a time in alphabetical order. The other girls in Briar Hollow were already being courted at 14. They were already learning to keep house. They were already learning to shrink themselves into the shapes their mothers had worn before them, and their grandmothers before that generations of women, folding themselves smaller and smaller, until there was nothing left to fold. Hazel had no interest in shrinking. She asked questions in the schoolroom that made the teacher tap his pencil against the desk and stare out the window at the mountain. She asked questions at the Methodist church on Sunday that made the pastor cough into his hand and change the subject. She spent her free afternoons in the woods above the hollow alone identifying plants and copying their leaves into a notebook she had made from butcher paper. She talked about soil composition. Nobody in Briar Hollow talked about soil composition. Nobody in Briar Hollow even knew the words for it. To the people of that town, the dirt was the dirt, and you put seeds in it, and sometimes things grew and sometimes they did not. And the difference between the two was God's mood that year. But Hazel had read in her botany book that there was no such thing as just dirt. There were sand fractions and clay fractions and silt fractions. There was the carbon content. There was the pH. There was the matter of how water moved through it and how heat held in it and what minerals it carried up from the rock below. The world to Hazel was full of secrets that were not secrets at all if you only knew where to look. And it made her strange. And it made her difficult. And it made her dangerous in a town that did not want any of those things from a girl. The trouble with Edgar Crowder began the way trouble always begins with a boy who has never been told no, and a girl who has no choice but to say it. Edgar was 17. He was thick through the shoulders the way his father was thick through the shoulders, and he had the same small, mean mouth that his father had, the same way of looking at people as though he were already calculating what they owed him. He had been watching Hazel for 2 years. She had felt it the way an animal feels the eye of something on the other side of the brush. She had changed her routes home from school 3 times to avoid him. It did not matter. The afternoon it happened, the leaves were turning. The 1st of October. The schoolhouse had let out, and Hazel had stayed late because the teacher had given her 3 new books to look at gifts from a cousin who had moved away to Cincinnati and left a small library behind. She had walked home alone with her geography textbook held against her chest, and Edgar Crowder had come out from behind the woodshed with 2 of his friends laughing somewhere down the trail. He pinned her against the back wall of the schoolhouse. The boards were rough against her shoulder blades. She could smell the chewing tobacco on his breath. She could smell the bay rum tonic he had put in his hair that morning to come find her. He was not in any hurry. He thought he had all the time in the world. "Be sweet to me now, Hazel," he said. "Be sweet and I'll tell my daddy to forgive that rent your grandma owes." She said nothing. She watched his face. She measured the distance between her hand and his nose. "Don't be like that," he said. "You ain't pretty enough to be like that." She brought the geography textbook up in a hard, short arc. She put her whole shoulder into it. The corner of the heavy book caught Edgar Crowder square across the bridge of the nose, and she heard the crack of cartilage breaking the way a dry stick breaks underfoot in winter. He went down on one knee with his hands over his face. Blood was already coming through his fingers. He was making a sound like a small animal that did not understand what had happened to it. His friends did not move. They stood 12 feet away with their mouths open, and one of them had gone gray in the face, the way men go gray when they suddenly understand that the world they thought they lived in is not the world they actually live in. Hazel walked past them. She did not run. She had read in a book somewhere that running was what predators were waiting for, and she was not going to give any of them that satisfaction. She walked the half-mile home with the textbook still pressed against her chest, and a small dark spot of Edgar Crowder's blood on the corner of it that would never quite come out no matter how she scrubbed. She told her grandmother what had happened. She told her plain. Vesta Whitaker sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands and rocked back and forth for a long time without making a sound. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry, and there was something in them that Hazel had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was a kind of grief that knows the shape of the thing coming and cannot get out of the way. "Child," Vesta said, "we are going to have to be very smart now. We are going to have to be smarter than we have ever been." Roland Crowder came to the rental house at 8 o'clock that night. He did not knock. He opened the door and walked in the way a man walks into a room he believes he owns. He took off his hat and set it on the kitchen table and looked around the small front room as though he were appraising the furniture, although there was nothing in that room worth appraising, and they both knew it. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Crowder," Vesta said. Hazel stood in the doorway to the back room. She did not come forward. She did not retreat. She watched Roland Crowder the way she had watched his son that afternoon, measuring distances, measuring weights, measuring the exact location of the iron poker that hung beside the fireplace. "Your granddaughter assaulted my boy this afternoon," Roland Crowder said. "My granddaughter defended herself this afternoon," Vesta said. "That is not the story I have heard. I expect it is not." Roland Crowder turned his head and looked at Hazel for the first time since he had come into the house. His eyes were small and pale, the color of dishwater, and they did not so much examine her as price her the way he might price a sack of feed at his store. "There is also the matter," he said, "of some peppermint candy missing from the jar. My boy says he saw your granddaughter take it 2 days ago. He kept quiet about it because he is, despite what you might think, a kind young man. But after what she did to him today, he no longer feels obligated to keep that kindness." Hazel did not move. She did not speak. She had already understood in the second after he said the word peppermint exactly what was happening and exactly how it was going to end. "There was no candy," Vesta said softly. "There is candy missing from the jar," Roland Crowder said. "And the sheriff is a reasonable man. He understands that boys exaggerate, but he is also a reasonable man about theft. And the rent on this house, Mrs. Whitaker, has been low for a very long time. Lower than it should be. I have been carrying you out of charity, out of respect for your late husband, who was a hard-working man. But charity has limits." He let that sit in the room for a moment. The kerosene lamp on the table guttered. Outside, somewhere down the hollow, a dog barked once and then stopped. "The rent on this house," he said, "is now $4 a month, effective tomorrow, unless your granddaughter is gone by morning." Vesta Whitaker did not look at Hazel. She kept her eyes on Roland Crowder. Her hands were folded in her lap, and they were trembling, and she could not stop them. $4, she said. $4. "I cannot pay $4. I know that, Mrs. Whitaker. That is why I have offered you the alternative." He picked up his hat. He set it carefully on his head. He nodded to Vesta the way a man nods at a funeral when he does not know what else to do with his face. He walked past Hazel without looking at her, and when he reached the front door, he paused with his hand on the latch. "It is a hard world, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "We must all be practical in it." Then he was gone. The door closed behind him very softly, which was somehow worse than if he had slammed it. Vesta Whitaker sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The lamp guttered down to nearly nothing, and she did not move to trim the wick. Hazel finally came forward and knelt beside her, and took the old woman's trembling hands between her own. "Grandmother," she said. "Don't," Vesta whispered. "Don't say it, child. Don't make me say it. I will go in the morning. There is no other way. There is no other way. I know there isn't. I have already known it for an hour." The old woman bent forward then and wept against her granddaughter's shoulder. She wept the way she had not wept since her own husband had died. The way she had not wept even when her son had gone north to Pittsburgh and never come back. She wept as though something inside her had broken that could never be put back together. And Hazel held her, and Hazel did not cry because one of them had to be steady. And it was not going to be the woman who was 68 years old and dying slowly of a husband's coal dust. In the small hours of the night when the lamp had finally burned itself out and the house was dark and cold, Vesta whispered something against Hazel's ear. The whisper was so quiet that even the wolves could not have heard it. "There is something I have never told you, child, about this town, about the Crowders. There are things I have known for 40 years that I have never spoken out loud. If I had been a braver woman, I would have spoken them. But I was not brave. And now it is too late for me to be brave. And there is only you." She paused. She gathered her breath. The rattle in her chest was bad that night, very bad. "When you walk out of here in the morning," she said, "you go west. Do you hear me? You go west into the mountains. You do not go down the valley. You do not go toward the rail line. The valley belongs to the Crowders. The rail line belongs to the Crowders. The mill towns are full of men who will sell you out for $1 to anyone with the Crowder name. But the mountain does not belong to anyone. The mountain has never belonged to anyone. The mountain will not betray you, child. The mountain will not betray you." Hazel pulled back and looked at her grandmother in the dark. She could not see her face. She could only feel the dry, cracked hand that was holding hers and the heat of the fever that was beginning to rise. "What do you know about them, grandmother?" "I know enough," Vesta whispered. "I know enough to know you have to live. Live, child. Live so that one day someone can finally tell what they are. Live." In the morning, when the door closed behind her and the bolt turned, Hazel Whitaker carried that whisper down the porch steps and out the gate and onto the frozen road. She did not understand all of what her grandmother had said. She did not have to understand. She had been told to go west, and west was a direction, and a direction was a beginning, and a beginning was more than she had thought she would have when she lay down on the kitchen floor the night before. She walked. The road out of Briar Hollow ran 2 directions. East ran down to the valley, to the rail line, to the possibility of a mill town that might need another pair of hands. East was where any sensible runaway girl would go. East was where Roland Crowder would expect her to go. East was where Roland Crowder would have men watching for her by noon. West ran up into the mountains, into the Monongahela National Forest, into ridges that folded over themselves like the pages of a closed book, and the hollows between them held secrets that even the old-timers only half remembered. Hazel went west. She walked for the better part of that first day. The morning frost turned to a thin mist that burned off by 10 o'clock and left the ridges in a hard, pale October sunlight. The sky was the color of bone. The wind moved through the canopy of oaks and hemlocks with a steady whispering sound. And underneath that there was the smaller sound of a creek somewhere down the slope. A creek she could hear but could not see. She followed a logging road that grew narrower as she climbed. By noon, the road was barely a road. By 2 o'clock, it was just a pair of ruts being slowly consumed by ferns and rhododendron. By 4 o'clock, there was no road at all, only the shape of where a road had been 20 years before. And the trees were closing in on both sides of her, and she was alone in a way she had never been alone in her life. Twice she thought she heard footsteps behind her. Twice she stopped and turned and saw nothing but the forest watching her go with its ancient, patient indifference. The second time she stood very still for almost a full minute, and she could feel her heart beating in her throat, and she could feel the weight of the geography textbook in the flour sack against her hip, and she thought, if it is Edgar Crowder, I will hit him again. I will hit him until he stops moving. There is no schoolhouse out here. There is no sheriff. There are no witnesses. There is only me and what I am willing to do. But it was not Edgar Crowder. It was only the wind and the small movements of small animals in the undergrowth, and her own fear walking 3 steps behind her like a second shadow. She kept climbing. It was late October, and she had perhaps 3 weeks before the real cold came. She had no food. She had no tools. She had no money. She had no one expecting her anywhere on earth. She had a flour sack and a botany book and a photograph of her mother and the memory of a whisper in the dark. She was 16 years old. The light began to fail at 5 o'clock. The sun did not so much set as drop behind the western ridge, and after that the temperature fell quickly. She could feel the heat going out of the air, the way a kettle cools when it is taken off the stove. Her breath came white. The undersides of the leaves she stepped on were already crisping with frost. She found shelter by stumbling into it in the dark. She had been walking with her arms out in front of her, feeling for branches when her shoulder hit a wall of cold sandstone, and she went down on one knee. She felt along the rock with her hands. The rock kept going. The rock turned a corner. The rock became, when she got her bearings, the front edge of a low overhang that ran some 12 or 15 feet back into the side of the ridge with a packed dirt floor, and a ceiling she could not stand fully upright under. It was not a cave. It was not warm. But it was out of the wind, and the wind had been the worst part of the last hour. And Hazel Whitaker crawled in under the rock and pulled the flour sack against her chest, and pulled the moth-eaten blanket around her shoulders, and listened to the forest settle into its first true night. The creek somewhere below, an owl calling from a dead tree 2 ridges over, the wind moving through the canopy like the breathing of something enormous and indifferent. She did not cry. She had learned years before that crying did not change the temperature or fill the stomach. And she had never been a girl who spent energy on things that didn't work. She slept in pieces. She would drift off for 10 minutes, then jerk awake at some sound, then lie shaking until exhaustion pulled her down again. Her body ached in places she had not known could ache. Her fingers were so stiff she could not quite close them. Her feet inside her boots had gone past cold, into something that was not pain anymore, which she knew from her botany book was the more dangerous thing. The thing that meant the body was beginning to give up its borders. Once around what she thought was 3 in the morning, she pulled the photograph of her mother out of the flour sack and held it against her chest under the blanket. She could not see it in the dark. She did not need to see it. She knew every line of that picture. The tilted straw hat, the basket of tomatoes, the smile aimed at someone the camera could not see, who Hazel had always quietly believed was her father, in the year before he became the kind of man who could leave. "I am so cold, Mama," she whispered to the photograph. "I am so cold." The photograph said nothing back. Photographs never do. But somehow, holding it against her chest, Hazel slept the rest of the way until dawn. She woke with the gray light. Her body had locked up overnight. Her right hip would not bend. Her left hand was the color of buttermilk. She lay for a long minute under the rock overhang and tried to remember why she should bother to move. And then she felt it. A faint warmth. Not in her body. Outside her body. Rising from somewhere below the overhang, climbing up the rock face, brushing against her cheek as soft as breath. A softness in the air that did not match the October morning. A smell that was not the smell of dead leaves and frost. A smell that was something like wet stone and something like minerals and something very faintly like the inside of a kitchen where bread had been baking. She moved. She made herself move. She got out from under the overhang on hands and knees because her legs were not yet ready to hold her, and she crawled to the lip of the rock shelf and looked down. Below her, the hillside dropped steeply into a narrow hollow she had not been able to see in the dark. The hollow was wreathed in a low fog that did not look like ordinary fog. It was thicker. It was wider. It moved differently. It rose in slow, unhurried curls from a single point at the bottom of the hollow like smoke from a chimney that had never gone out. At the bottom of the hollow, rising from a crack in the layered sandstone water, was flowing. Not Coal Mountain water. Warm water. She could see the steam now separating itself from the morning fog as the light grew, curling up into the cold air with a quiet, steady persistence that had probably been going on for 1,000 years before any human being had ever stood where she was standing. Hazel Whitaker, 16 years old, kicked out of her grandmother's house with 2 dresses and a botany book, came down off that rock shelf on legs that barely worked. She slipped twice. She caught herself on rhododendron branches. She left a streak of blood on a sharp stone where her palm opened against it, and she did not even notice. She got down to the floor of the hollow and she stood at the edge of the warm spring, and she went down on her knees in the dark mineral mud at the edge of the basin. She put her hands in the water. It was warm, not scalding, not boiling. It was the temperature of a bath drawn for someone you loved. It was the temperature of life. Her botany book had a chapter on geothermal phenomena, on the way the Earth's heat could come to the surface in certain places where the rock had been broken open by some movement millions of years ago. And she had read that chapter twice because she had thought it was beautiful, and she had never imagined for a single second of her life that she would ever see one with her own eyes. And now here she was. And her hands were in it, and she was not going to die that night after all. She lifted her hands out of the water. The steam rose from her wet fingers into the cold air. She looked at the spring. She looked at the mineral-stained rocks around it, banded with orange and yellow. She looked at the moss growing thick and green where everything else on the mountain had gone brown for the year. She looked at a small patch of watercress trembling in the overflow bright green in October. An impossible color. A color that should not have existed in this season anywhere within 50 miles of where she knelt, and she began very quietly to think. The hollow was sheltered on 3 sides by the mountain. The warm spring kept the immediate area several degrees warmer than the surrounding forest. There were flat stones along the edge of the basin. There were fallen timbers further up the slope. There was the rock overhang she had slept under. There was the dense rhododendron thicket along the creek that broke the wind. It was not a home. Not yet. Not by any reasonable definition of the word. But it was a possibility. Hazel Whitaker kneeling in the mineral mud beside a hot spring in a hollow that nobody in Briar Hollow knew existed. Watched the steam rise into the morning. And she felt something move in her chest that she had not felt since the day her mother died. It was not happiness. It was something older and quieter than happiness. It was the thing a person feels when they realize against all the evidence of their life that they have not yet been written off by the world. It was the thing a person feels when they realize there is still something left to do. She got to her feet. She walked back up the slope to the rock overhang. She took the flour sack and the moth-eaten blanket and the geography textbook with the small dark stain of Edgar Crowder's blood in the corner. She brought them down to the warm spring. She sat down on a flat stone where the heat from the water was warming the rock through, and she ate the last of the cornbread her grandmother had pressed into her hand at the kitchen door at 5 o'clock that morning. And she watched the steam rise off the water. Somewhere behind her in the brush an animal moved. A deer, maybe, a fox. She did not look. She was not afraid anymore. Or rather, she was afraid of different things. Now more practical things. Things she could begin to make plans about. She finished the cornbread. She drank from the warm spring with cupped hands, and the water tasted faintly of iron and faintly of sulfur. And underneath that it tasted like the bones of the mountain itself. The sun climbed higher. The fog burned off the upper slopes. Down in the hollow where the warm spring kept the air thick and white, the fog did not burn off at all. It just kept rising slow and steady. The breath of something old and patient and indifferent to the small troubles of a girl from Briar Hollow. Hazel Whitaker sat by the warm water and began to plan. She did not know yet that what she was beginning to plan would in time defeat winter itself. She did not know that the methods she was about to invent alone with nothing but a botany book and her own stubbornness would feed 3 counties through hard winters, and would be written about in agricultural journals and would be cited in textbooks she would never live long enough to read all of. She did not know that the woman who had locked the door behind her would one day sit in the place she was about to build and weep with gratitude. She did not know that the man who had taken everything from her would die alone in a town that could no longer remember why it had ever feared him. She did not know any of it. She only knew that the water was warm, that the sun was rising, that the photograph of her mother was still inside the flour sack against her hip, that she was 16 years old and alive and not yet finished no matter what Briar Hollow had decided about her. She only knew that she had been told to go west, and west had been right. For the first 2 weeks, Hazel Whitaker nearly died 3 times. The first time was on the 5th day. The rain had come in just before dawn, a cold, steady October rain that turned the slope above the warm spring into a sheet of running mud and slick leaves. She had been climbing back to the rock overhang with an armload of pine boughs she had broken off a fallen tree, planning to weave them into the gaps in her makeshift shelter, when her left boot found a patch of moss-covered shale and went out from under her. She came down hard on her right side. The pine boughs scattered. Her shin caught the edge of a sharp stone, and she felt the skin open the way fabric tears when a nail goes through it. A small, clean ripping that hurt less in the first second than it would in the 10th. She lay there in the mud and the rain. She could see the white of bone in the gash before the blood came welling up to cover it. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury for people who had options. She had read a chapter in her botany book on field medicine, a chapter the author had clearly added because he was writing for a country that was 3 years into a depression and full of people who would never see the inside of a hospital. And she remembered it now the way a drowning person remembers how to swim. She crawled the 40 feet down the slope to a patch of sphagnum moss she had noticed the day before, growing in a damp cleft between 2 stones. She tore a handful of it free with her bare hands. The moss was cold and wet and absorbent, and her botany book had told her that the old people of the British Isles had used it as a wound dressing for 1,000 years before anyone had a word for the antiseptic compounds it contained. She packed the moss into the wound. She tore a strip from the hem of her second dress and bound the moss tight against her shin. She crawled the rest of the way to the warm spring, dragging her bad leg behind her. And she sat at the edge of the basin, and put her shaking hands into the warm water until the feeling came back into her fingers and her teeth stopped chattering. The wound did not become infected. The moss held. By the end of the second week, she could walk on the leg again, and the scar that came up was clean and pale, and she would carry it the rest of her life as the first lesson the mountain ever taught her. Lesson 1. The forest will hurt you. The forest will also heal you. The forest does not care which one you remember. The second time she nearly died was on the 9th day, and it was her own fault, and she would never quite forgive herself for it. She had eaten a handful of berries. They had looked like service berries. They had been the right size and the right color. They had been growing in a place where service berries should grow. But her botany book was clear that there were 3 plants in the eastern mountains that produced fruit that resembled service berries, and only one of them was safe to eat. And the difference came down to the shape of a small notch on the underside of the leaf. And Hazel had been so hungry by the 9th day that she had not bothered to check the leaf. She knew what she had done about an hour after she ate them. The first wave of nausea hit her halfway through gathering firewood. The second wave brought her to her knees. By dark, she was lying on the heated stones at the edge of the spring, with her stomach trying to turn itself inside out, and her vision swimming and the sound of her own pulse very loud in her ears. She thought she was dying. There was a long time somewhere past midnight when she was sure of it. She lay on those warm stones and she watched the steam rising into the cold black sky, and she said out loud to no one, "I'm sorry, Mama. I'm sorry I didn't make it." She did not die. She lay there for the rest of that night, and most of the next day, and somewhere in the second night, her body finished pushing the poison out, and she slept for 14 hours straight, and she woke on the morning of the 11th day so weak she could barely lift her own head, but alive. Lesson 2. The forest will not forgive carelessness. There is no second draft of carelessness in the woods. There is only the consequence, and you survive it or you do not. The third time she nearly died was on the 14th day, and it was a thing she could not have prevented and could not have planned against, because nobody ever plans against the weather. The rain came back at sundown. The rain turned to sleet by midnight. The sleet turned to wet snow by 3 in the morning. And by then, everything she owned was soaked through. The pine boughs of her shelter had collapsed under the weight of the ice. The moth-eaten blanket was a heavy wet rope around her shoulders. Her boots were full of slush. She could not feel her feet. She could not feel her hands. Her body had begun to shiver, in the deep, slow, irregular way that the books called the late stage, the stage just before the body gives up shivering altogether, and the heart simply stops. She crawled to the warm spring. She did not walk. She could not have walked. She crawled the last 50 feet on her hands and knees, and she rolled herself into the warm basin, fully clothed boots and all. And she lay there with her chin just above the water for the rest of that night. The water saved her. The water saved her the way a mother's arms save a child who has fallen in deep snow. She did not get out until the gray dawn light came over the eastern ridge, and when she finally did get out, she was not strong, but she was alive, and she understood for the first time in a way she had not understood before exactly what the spring was. It was not a luxury. It was not a curiosity. It was the only reason she was going to survive the winter. The spring was the heart of everything. Whatever she built next, she was going to build it around that heart. Lesson 3. You do not own this water. The water is letting you live. Be worthy of the gift. It was at the end of the second week, sitting on a heated stone at the edge of the basin, with her drying clothes stiff against her skin, that Hazel Whitaker began to truly think. She was looking at the rock overhang where she had been sleeping. She was looking at the slope above the spring where the soil was thin over the underlying sandstone. She was looking at the way the warm air from the water created a pocket of comfort in the bottom of the hollow, a pocket that could not extend more than a few feet up the slope before the cold wind cut it off. She thought about the root cellars she had seen at farms down in the valley, the way they stayed cool in summer and above freezing in winter because the earth itself was an insulator, because 4 feet of dirt over your head was warmer in January than any woodhouse in the county. She thought about a passage in her botany book. There had been a paragraph in a chapter on greenhouse design, almost a footnote about how the Romans had heated the floors of their bathhouses by running warm water through clay pipes laid beneath the stone. Hypocaustum, the book had called it. She had read that paragraph 3 times when she had first found it, because the word had a music to it that she liked the music of an old language solving a practical problem, in a way that was also somehow beautiful. She thought about the slope above the warm spring. She thought, what if I don't build on top of the ground? What if I build into it? She started the next morning. Her tools were a flat sandstone slab she had pried loose from the creek bed and shaped into a crude blade, a hardwood stick with a fire-hardened point that she had made by holding the end of it in a small cooking fire and turning it slowly until the wood blackened, and her own bare hands. Nothing else. No shovel. No pick. No axe. She picked the spot with care. She walked the slope above the spring 3 times before she chose it. She wanted a place where the natural cleft of the sandstone had already started the work for her, where she could follow a fracture line the mountain itself had made, and she found one about 12 feet above the basin on the south-facing wall of the hollow, where 2 great slabs of rock had pulled apart over thousands of years to leave a narrow seam of softer earth and weathered stone in between them. She started digging. The work was brutal in a way she could not have imagined before she began it. The first day she dug for 9 hours, and at the end of it she had moved perhaps 2 bushels of earth and rock. Her hands bled. Her back locked up so badly that night that she could not roll over without crying out. Her shoulders developed a deep ache that would not leave her for the next 6 weeks, an ache that lived in her muscles even on the days she did not work, an ache that woke her up at night and did not let her go back to sleep. But she had something most adults did not have, and it was the only thing about her circumstance that was an advantage. She was 16 years old. Her body, which was being abused beyond anything it had ever known, was also young enough to still build itself in response. The blisters tore open and bled, and underneath them new skin came in. The new skin tore open and bled, and under that came the calluses, thick layers of yellow horn across her palms that the stones could no longer cut. Her shoulders hurt every morning, and every morning she could lift a little more than the morning before. She was learning that the body is also a tool. The body can also be sharpened against a problem. She dug for 6 weeks. She dug through the last of October. She dug through the first hard freezes of November, when the ground became so cold that her stone blade rang against it like she was striking a bell. She dug through the first real snowfall, scooping snow out of her excavation in the morning before she could begin work. She dug on days when the wind cut through her dress so badly that she had to stop every 20 minutes and crawl back to the warm spring to put her hands in the water until the feeling came back. And as she dug, she discovered things that would change everything. She discovered that the earth got warmer as she went deeper. Not warmer the way a basement gets warmer than the air outside, although that was part of it. Warmer because the heat of the spring was radiating through the bedrock, warming the soil for yards in every direction around the source. 3 feet down the dirt was the temperature of a spring afternoon. 5 feet down on certain stretches close to the rock seam, the dirt was actually warm to the touch, the way a stone feels when it has been sitting in the sun. She discovered that the mud at the edge of the spring, when she mixed it with dried grass and a pinch of ash from her cooking fire, and let it dry in the sun, made something almost like mortar. Not as strong as cement, not as smooth, but strong enough to bind stones together, strong enough to seal cracks against the wind, strong enough to hold a wall up, if you laid it carefully and let it dry properly between courses. She discovered that flat creek stones heated for an hour in the overflow channel of the spring would stay warm for almost 5 hours afterward. She could carry one in her apron, and her stomach would not feel cold. She could put one inside her sleeping place at night, and at 3 in the morning it would still be giving off heat against the small of her back. She discovered by the 3rd week of digging that she had begun to talk to the spring as though it were a person. She would come down at the end of a hard day, and she would sit at the edge of the basin and put her feet in, and she would say, "I cut my hand again today. Look at it. Look what you made me do." And she would feel in the warmth that came up around her ankles something that was not quite an answer, but was not quite silence either. She did not think she was crazy for talking to the water. She thought she was a person who had not heard another human voice in 7 weeks, and she thought the spring was the only thing within 10 miles that had taken any visible interest in keeping her alive. If that did not earn the spring the right to be spoken to, then nothing in the world ever earned anything. By the end of the 6th week, she had hollowed out a chamber in the side of the mountain that was 8 feet deep and 6 feet across and 5 feet high. Not enough to stand up fully, enough to sit to sleep to keep alive. She lined the walls with flat stones. She did not have proper mortar between every stone, but she packed the gaps with her mud and grass mixture, and she let each layer dry for a day and a night before she put the next one on top. She built the wall back on itself course by course, the way she had seen old men build dry stone walls in the meadows down in the valley. The way that worked because gravity itself was holding it together, rather than fighting against it. She built a frame for the entrance from the straightest saplings she could cut, with her stone blade lashed at the corners with strips of inner bark she had peeled from a dead hickory. She covered the frame with layers of pine boughs, then a layer of bark sheets, then a final layer of the mud and grass mixture that she packed on by hand and smoothed flat and let dry into something almost as hard as the stone it was sealing. And then finally, she did the thing she had been planning since the 2nd week of digging, the thing that would make the difference between a hole in the ground and a home. She cut a shallow channel into the sandstone floor of the chamber. She cut it with her stone blade, working an hour or 2 at a time. A finger's depth at a stroke until she had a groove that ran the full 8 feet from the entrance to the back wall and was perhaps 3 inches deep and 4 inches across. She cut a matching channel through the rock seam between the chamber and the spring, working from both ends until the channels met. She lined the channels with the most polished flat stones she could find. She sealed every gap in the lining with mud and ash and let it set for 3 days. On the morning she finished, she went down to the spring with her water bucket. She broke open the small earthen dam she had built to keep the spring's overflow on its old course. She watched the water find its new path. She watched it disappear into the channel she had cut. She walked back up the slope to the entrance of her chamber. And she got down on her knees and she crawled inside, and she watched the warm water come flowing along the floor of her underground room, and steam come up from it in slow, lazy curls, and the cold air at the back of the chamber begin almost immediately to feel different. She lay down on the dirt floor next to the channel of warm water. She put her cheek down beside the running water. She closed her eyes. She was 16 years old. She was alone in the woods of West Virginia in the middle of December of 1937. She had been thrown out of her grandmother's house 71 days before, and she was warm. She wept then in a way she had not let herself weep on the porch of her grandmother's house or under the rock overhang on that first terrible night, or any time in the 11 weeks since. She wept against the warm stone with her hand in the running water, and the steam rose past her face, and she did not try to stop herself, because there was no one to see, because there was nothing left to prove, because she had built a thing that was going to keep her alive. And a person was allowed to weep in the presence of something they had built that was going to keep them alive. When she was done weeping, she sat up and wiped her face on her sleeve, and she got to work on the next thing. The winter settled in around her, and Hazel Whitaker settled into it. She improved the underground cabin every day. She cut a small smoke hole through the ceiling at the back of the chamber with a stone flue she had built up from carefully fitted slabs, so she could have a small cooking fire inside on the coldest days without the smoke choking her. She built a sleeping shelf out of saplings, lashed together and stretched canvas she had fashioned from her ruined second dress, raising her bed up off the floor, where the warmth of the channel collected most thickly. She dug a storage alcove into the back wall of the chamber, a small dry space where she could keep her dwindling food without the warm humidity rotting it. She wove a second blanket from strips of inner bark and dried grasses, working at it in the long evenings by the light of a small tallow candle she had made from rendered groundhog fat and a length of cotton string. The blanket was rough. The blanket was ugly. The blanket held heat better than the moth-eaten wool she had carried out of Briar Hollow. And that was what mattered, because beauty was not a thing the winter cared about, and neither was she. She ate what the mountain offered, and what her botany book taught her to take. She gathered hickory nuts and black walnuts in the old groves on the upper slopes, cracking them on a flat stone she kept by the entrance of the cabin. The meats rich and oily and good against the cold. She dug the starchy, tuberous roots of cattails out of a boggy stretch downstream, washing the mud off them in the warm water, eating them roasted in the embers of her small fire. She gathered the dried berries that had clung through the autumn on the wild rose bushes, sour and full of seeds, but full of something her body needed, something that kept the blood from going thin. She set snares for rabbits, and she lost more meals than she caught for the first month, until she learned by trial and by failure the small particular places along a rabbit's regular path where a snare could be set, so that the rabbit would put its head into the loop without thinking. She caught her first rabbit on a Tuesday in early December. She killed it with a stone, and she cleaned it the way she had watched her grandmother clean rabbits 100 times, and she cooked it slow over her small fire with a few wild onion bulbs she had saved from the autumn, and it was the best meal she had eaten since she had walked out of Briar Hollow, and she ate it sitting on her sleeping shelf, with the steam rising from the water channel and the snow falling outside her bark and mud door, and she felt for a moment a thing she had almost forgotten the name for. She felt for a moment content. She was thin. She was tired. She was sometimes so lonely that she would talk out loud for hours, telling the spring about her day, telling her mother's photograph what she had built and what she planned to build next, telling the geography textbook with its dark stain in the corner that she had used it for a better purpose than geography ever was. But she was alive. The winter wore on. She was alive. The candle burned down. She was alive. She had begun to notice something. The plants growing closest to the warm spring did not die back the way the rest of the forest had died back. The mosses stayed green all winter. Certain ferns kept their fronds well into December. There was a small patch of chickweed that had appeared along the edge of her warm water channel, growing in the dirt where she had spilled water carrying it for cooking. And the chickweed was green. It was green in January. In January in West Virginia in 1938, in the coldest winter anyone had recorded in 22 years, there was a small patch of green chickweed growing 6 feet from her front door. because the earth around the spring was still warm enough to let it grow. The thought that came to her then was the kind of thought that once you have it, you cannot unhave, no matter how hard you try. If chickweed could grow here in January, what else could? She was lying on her sleeping shelf when the thought came. She was looking at the steam rising from the water channel. The shape of the thought arrived in her mind the way the shape of the underground cabin had arrived in her mind 2 months before, all at once, complete terrible in its obviousness. She sat up so fast she hit her head on the ceiling. She started small. She started with what she had. She had a handful of dried serviceberry seeds she had saved out of curiosity. She had 2 wizened potatoes she had found in the corner of an abandoned root cellar, at a homestead on a ridge 2 miles north, an old place where the people had walked away during the worst of the Depression and left their last harvest to rot. She had a small pouch of wild onion bulbs. She had 3 or 4 dried bean pods she had pulled out of the bottom of her flour sack one day. Beans her grandmother must have put in there at the last moment without saying anything. She cleared a patch of ground beside the warm spring, where the heat of the water radiated through the bedrock and the soil never quite froze. She turned the dirt with her stone blade and her hardwood digging stick. She mixed in the ash from her cooking fire and the rotted leaves from under the rhododendron thickets, the way her botany book had told her good gardeners did. She built a crude cold frame over the patch from flat stones along the edges and sheets of birch bark, angled across the top, trapping the warm, humid air rising from the spring underneath them, holding the thin January sun where it could do some work. She planted. Things grew. Not well. Not fast. Not in the abundance of a real garden. But by the second week of February, when the rest of West Virginia was locked solid under a foot of crusted snow, when the cattle in the valley were dying in their stalls, and the old people were dying in their beds, Hazel Whitaker had pale green shoots pushing up out of warm soil under sheets of birch bark beside a hot spring in a hollow that nobody knew existed. She had done a thing that the people of Briar Hollow would have said could not be done. She had not even known when she planted those seeds that it could not be done. That was the only reason it had worked. Nobody had been there to tell her it was impossible. She harvested the first thinnings in the last week of February. Pale green shoots of chickweed and wild onion mixed into the broth of her morning rabbit. The taste of green things in her mouth in February. She closed her eyes and held the broth on her tongue, and she felt something move behind her sternum that was not gratitude exactly, and was not pride exactly, but was some third thing made of both of them, a feeling she had no name for, a feeling she would carry the rest of her life and still never have a name for. It was a Tuesday in March of 1938 when she met Silas Bowen. She had been kneeling at the edge of one of her cold frames thinning a row of new potato sprouts with her fingers when she felt the change in the air behind her. It was a change so small that someone who had lived the past 5 months in a town would not have caught it. But Hazel had spent 5 months alone with the breathing of the forest, and she knew the difference between a forest that was empty and a forest that was occupied. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the potato sprouts. She let her right hand drift very slowly toward the handle of her stone blade, where she had laid it on a flat rock by her knee. "You don't need that, child," a voice said behind her. The voice was old. The voice was tired. The voice was kind in a way she had not heard a voice be kind in 5 months. An old man with bad lungs ain't gonna hurt anybody. Hazel stood up. She turned around. She kept the stone blade in her hand, but she let her arm hang down at her side. There was an old man at the edge of the hollow. He was leaning on a long cane cut from a hickory branch. He was perhaps 75 years old. His face was the color and texture of old paper. He was wearing a coat too big for him, the coat of a man who had been a much larger man 20 years before. And underneath the coat she could hear his breathing, and the breathing had a wet rattle in it, that she knew the sound of the sound she had heard at night through the wall of her grandmother's bedroom for the last 7 years. The old man was not looking at her. He was looking at the cold frame. He was looking at the patch of green sprouts pushing up out of the warm soil. He was looking at the steam rising from the channel that ran past her cabin door. He was looking at the cabin door itself, the door of stone and bark and dried mortar, and the carefully laid path of flat stones leading down to the spring. He looked for a long time. He did not speak. He just looked. When he finally turned his eyes to her, there was something in them that she had not seen directed at her in 5 months, and had not seen often even before that. It was respect. "How long you been up here, child?" "Since October." He looked back at the cold frame. He looked back at the cabin. He shook his head very slowly. "Did anybody help you?" "No, sir. Nobody at all. There wasn't anybody to help." He sat down. He did not so much sit as lower himself slowly onto a flat stone by the edge of the spring, the way an old man sits when his knees have decided that standing is no longer free. He laid his hickory cane across his lap. He took off his cap, and his hair was white and thin against his pink scalp, and he held the cap in both hands the way men of his generation had been taught to hold their hats in the presence of something serious. "My name is Silas Bowen," he said. "I've been coming to this spring since I was a boy. My grandfather brought me here the first time. We called it the Devil's Kettle because the old folks thought warm water coming out of the earth was unnatural. I never thought it was unnatural. I thought it was kind. Hazel Whitaker. I know who you are, child. I knew who you were the second I saw your eyes." She did not understand what he meant by that, and he did not explain. "I knew your grandmother when she was a young woman," he said. "I knew your grandfather, too. Your grandfather and I worked the same shaft for 9 years before his lungs went. He was a good man, a quiet man. He used to tell me he had a son who could read 3 books at the same time and remember every word of all 3. That son was your daddy." Hazel sat down. She did not know she was going to sit down until she had done it. She sat on a stone 6 feet away from the old man, and she felt the strength go out of her legs, because she had not heard another person say her father's name in 7 years. Silas Bowen did not look at her while she got herself back together. He had the courtesy not to. He looked at the cold frame, at the green sprouts pushing up under the bark, and he shook his head one more time slowly. "I come up here every few weeks to soak my joints," he said. "The warm water, it helps with the rheumatism. I've been coming up here for 68 years, child. And in 68 years, I have never seen anything like what you have built down here. Not in this hollow. Not in any hollow. It's just stone," she said. "And mud. And water. It is not just stone and mud and water, child. It is what a person has done with stone and mud and water. That is a different thing, and you know it is a different thing, or you would not have built it." He came back 3 days later. He brought a sack of cornmeal. He brought a small hand axe with a chipped blade and a sound handle. He brought a pouch of seed potatoes that had been kept properly through the winter in a real root cellar, with eyes already showing on them ready to plant. He brought a small bag of bean seeds that his wife had saved the year she died 6 years before, and had labeled in her own handwriting on the outside of the bag, and that he had not been able to bring himself to use because using them would have meant his wife was finally and truly gone. He did not offer any of it as charity. He understood the way some men understand without being told that a girl who had built what Hazel had built would not accept charity and would be right not to accept it. He offered a trade. He wanted the right to soak in the spring whenever he came up the mountain. In exchange, he would bring her tools and seeds and a few small things she could not get for herself. He would bring news from the valley if she wanted news, and would bring no news from the valley if she did not. She accepted. It was the first fair deal anybody had offered her since her mother died. Over the weeks that followed, Silas Bowen taught her things her botany book did not contain. He taught her how to read the soil by its color, and by its smell, and by the way it crumbled in your hand. He taught her how to know when a frost was truly done by watching the dogwood trees, which would not put out their full bloom until the ground was warm enough to hold a planting. He taught her how to set a fence post that would hold for 40 years. He taught her how to split firewood along the natural grain so the wood would not fight against you. He listened in return while she read aloud to him from the botany book. He listened the way a man listens who has spent his whole life working with his hands and has always wondered in some quiet part of himself what the words were for the things he already knew. When she would read a passage about chlorophyll or about the nitrogen cycle or about the way certain plants drew up minerals from the deep rock, he would close his eyes and nod, and sometimes he would say, "That is what I have always seen. I just never knew the name of it." Together that spring and summer of 1938, they expanded what she had begun. Hazel was the one who designed it. Hazel was the one who had drawn the plans on the inside cover of the botany book, who had measured the slopes, who had worked out where the warm water would have to go, and how the structure would have to angle to catch the sun. Silas was the one who could swing the axe. She could not swing the one whose hands could lift a stone. She could not lift alone the one whose 40 years of building had taught his fingers things she would have taken a decade to learn on her own. They dug a second underground space larger than the first, with proper stone-lined channels that could circulate warm spring water beneath raised planting beds. They built a frame over the top of saplings, an oiled canvas Silas brought up from his cabin, creating a structure that was part root cellar and part greenhouse, and entirely heated by the breath of the earth itself. They called it the warm room. The name was simple. The name did not begin to describe what the thing was. By July of 1938, the warm room was producing food. Beans, potatoes, squash cabbages, tomatoes, herbs of half a dozen kinds. The warm spring water and the sheltered hollow created growing conditions that extended the season by weeks on either side of what was normal at the elevation. And the warm room did not care about the elevation at all, because the warm room was a small private climate that the mountain had given them, and they had finished. By the second winter, Hazel had enough stored and enough still growing under the warm room that she went into the cold months without the desperation of the year before. She had jars of preserved tomatoes lined up on a shelf she had built into the back wall of her cabin. She had crocks of sauerkraut. She had braids of dried beans hanging from the ceiling like strange ornaments and bunches of herbs hanging beside them, and a smoked rabbit in the storage alcove, and 3 small bags of seed she had saved out for the next planting. She had become, in the space of 14 months, a thing that the people of Briar Hollow would not have believed if they had been told. She had become a farmer. The trouble found her on a clear morning in late October of 1940. She was kneeling in the warm room transplanting cabbage seedlings when she heard voices on the upper ridge. 3 voices. Men's voices. They were not trying to be quiet. They were laughing about something, and one of them was singing a snatch of a song she half remembered from the church socials of her childhood, and they were coming down the slope in her direction with the unhurried walk of men who believe they are going somewhere they have a right to go. Hazel stood up slowly. She wiped the dirt off her hands on her apron. She walked out of the warm room and across the small clearing to where her cabin stood, and she reached inside the door and took down the hand axe Silas had given her. 2.5 years before the axe she had sharpened 100 times since the axe, whose handle had taken on the particular polish that wood gets when it has been held in one person's grip for a long time. She walked to the entrance of the hollow. She stopped at the place where the slope came down through the rhododendron thicket. She stood with the axe held loose at her side, and she waited. The first man came down through the brush. He was 20 years old now. He was thicker through the shoulders even than he had been at 17. The bridge of his nose still carried the small visible bend where her geography textbook had broken it 3 Octobers before, and his eyes had the same small mean look that she remembered. And his mouth had the same small mean shape, and he saw her standing at the bottom of the slope with the axe in her hand, and he stopped where he was on the path. "Hello, Edgar," she said. Edgar Crowder did not move. Behind him, 2 men were coming down through the rhododendron, breathing hard from the climb, and they did not see Hazel until they were almost at Edgar's shoulder. The one on the left was a heavy-set man in a brown wool coat with a surveyor's chain coiled over his arm and a ledger book wedged under his elbow. The one on the right was younger, hardly older than Edgar himself, a man Hazel did not recognize, with a Crowder Coal Company patch sewn onto the front of his cap. The 3 of them stood there at the edge of the rhododendron, and Hazel stood 20 feet below them, with the axe held loose at her side. And for a long moment the only sound in the hollow was the steady whisper of the warm water running through the channels she had cut into the rock. Edgar's right hand was at his face. The fingers had gone up there without his noticing. They were touching the small bend in the bridge of his nose, the way a man touches an old scar when something reminds him of how he got it. "Hazel," he said. "Hazel Whitaker," she said. "I have a last name. Use it." The heavy-set man with the surveyor's chain stepped forward. He had the manner of a man who was used to being listened to in courthouses and at title offices, and he did not seem to understand that he had walked into a place where his manner was not currency. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "my name is Dorsey Hamlin. I am here on behalf of the Crowder Coal and Land Company. We have reason to believe that this hollow contains a thermal spring of significant commercial value, and we are here today to conduct a preliminary survey for the purpose of establishing—" "You are not surveying anything today," Hazel said. Dorsey Hamlin paused. He looked at her. He looked at the axe in her hand. He looked at Edgar Crowder, whose hand was still at his nose. "Miss Whitaker," he said more carefully now, "I do not believe you understand the legal situation. This land is unregistered, under the laws of West Virginia. This land is registered, Mr. Hamlin." That stopped him. He blinked at her once and then a second time. "I beg your pardon. This land was registered at the Pocahontas County Courthouse in 1922. The deed is in the name of Silas Bowen. He bought the parcel for $210 from the estate of a man named Wallace Pruitt. The recorded boundary runs from the cleft oak on the eastern ridge down across the hollow to the third bend of the creek on the western side. You are standing on it. So am I." She paused. She kept her eyes on Edgar. "You can ride down to the courthouse and check, Mr. Hamlin. You should have checked already. A man with a surveyor's chain ought to know better than to walk onto somebody's land without checking." Silas Bowen had told her about the deed only once, almost a year before, and almost in passing. He had been splitting wood beside her cabin, and he had stopped to lean on the axe handle and catch his breath. And he had said without looking up, "By the way, child, the title to this hollow is at the courthouse in my name. I've been meaning to mention it. I bought it the year my wife and I married because we wanted some place we could come and not see another human being. We never built on it, just visited the spring. After my wife died, I forgot about it for a while. Last year I rode down and had the deed brought current. I thought you ought to know in case you ever needed it." He had gone back to splitting wood, and Hazel had stood there for a long moment looking at him. And she had understood even then that he had told her this for exactly the reason she was speaking it now. Dorsey Hamlin's face had changed. The official manner had drained out of it the way water drains out of a cracked basin. He turned his head and looked at Edgar Crowder. "Edgar, did your father know about this?" "My father said the land was unclaimed." "Your father was wrong." "My father is not wrong, Mr. Hamlin." But Edgar's voice had gone thin. He had heard the same as Dorsey Hamlin had heard the precision of the words that had come out of Hazel Whitaker's mouth. He had heard the date. He had heard the price. He had heard the description of the boundary lines. These were not the words of a girl who had been bluffing. These were the words of a girl who was telling them what they would find when they went down to the courthouse to check. The third man, the young one with the company cap, had taken a step backward without realizing it. Hazel did not raise the axe. She did not need to. "You crossed a line 3 years ago, Edgar," she said. "Behind the schoolhouse. Do you remember?" He said nothing. "I asked if you remembered." "I remember. You crossed a line and your father covered it for you. He sent me into the woods to die. I did not die. Look around, Edgar. Look at what I built while I was supposed to be dying. You came here today thinking you were going to find an empty hollow with a hot spring you could sell to investors out of Pittsburgh. What you found is mine. The land, the water, the structures. All of it. Mine and Silas Bowen's, and the law of this state will agree with us because the law of this state is on paper at the courthouse and you and your father have miscounted what is on paper." She let that sit. "Now you turn around and you walk back up that slope and you tell your father what you found here. You tell him every word. You tell him that the girl he tried to kill is alive. You tell him that the spring his daughter, the surveyor, wanted to sell has a deed on it, and the deed is not his. You tell him I have neighbors now, Edgar. 3 families across 2 ridges have been trading with me for 2 winters. Their children are eating because of what I taught them. Their grandparents are warm because of stones I helped them set in their walls. Your father owns a town. I have begun to plant something else. You tell him that too." Edgar Crowder stared at her. She held his eyes. She did not let him look away. "Go home, Edgar." He went. He did not say another word. He turned on the slope and he walked back up through the rhododendron and Dorsey Hamlin, and the young man with the company cap went after him, and the surveyor's chain clinked once as it caught against a branch, and then they were gone. And the only sound in the hollow was the steady whisper of the warm water running where she had taught it to run. Hazel stood at the bottom of the slope with the axe in her hand for a long time after they were gone. She did not move until her legs began to shake. Then she sat down on the path. She put the axe across her knees. She put her face in her hands. She did not weep. She had passed beyond weeping at some point in the last 3 years. But she sat there for a long time with her face in her hands. And she let her shoulders shake. And after a while, she got up and walked back to the warm room and finished transplanting the cabbage seedlings. Because the cabbage seedlings did not care that Edgar Crowder had come and gone, and the cabbage seedlings still needed to be in the ground before the light failed. Silas Bowen brought the news on a gray afternoon at the end of October. He came up the mountain slower than usual. Hazel saw him from a long way off climbing the last rise to the hollow, and she knew before he had reached her that he was carrying something he did not want to carry. He was 76 years old that fall. The white in his hair had gone the color of old ash. His breath made a sound she did not like. He sat down on the flat stone by the spring before he tried to speak, and he sat there for a full minute, with his hands on his knees, looking down at the steam. "Child," he said, "tell me. Your grandmother is dying." She did not move. She had been kneeling at the edge of the warm room, and she stayed kneeling, and her hands stayed open on her thighs. And she watched a small piece of bark drift along the surface of the channel. and disappear into the lip of the basin. How bad? Pneumonia. Both lungs. The cough has been bad for 2 months, but she didn't want anyone to know. She would not let the neighbors call a doctor. The doctor in Marlinton would not have come anyway because she has not paid a doctor's bill in 11 years, and Roland Crowder has put the word out about her. The chimney, Hazel said. The chimney is split. The flue draws backwards. The smoke is filling the front room. The windows have been broken for 2 winters. She has them stuffed with rags. Roland will not send a man to fix it. He says she owes back rent. He says he will fix it when she pays. Silas paused. He looked up at her then. There was something in his eyes that she had seen only once before, on the day they had met. And that had been a thing of wonder and respect. And this was the same shape, but turned inside out a thing of helplessness and grief. She is freezing in her own bed, child. She is freezing, and the women in town who would help her are afraid of the Crowders, and she will not last another week. Hazel got up. She did not say anything. She walked to her cabin, and she went inside, and she pulled the flour sack from where it had been hanging on a nail beside the door for almost 3 years. The same flour sack she had carried out of Briar Hollow with 2 dresses and a botany book. And she began to pack. She packed differently this time. She packed dried beans in cloth bundles, 3 pounds of them. She packed 2 jars of tomatoes she had put up that fall. She packed a smoked rabbit in oilcloth. She packed a small leather pouch of dried herbs she had grown in the warm room mint and yarrow, and the bark of the slippery elm tree that her botany book said was good for the lungs. She packed 3 smooth, flat creek stones that she had been heating in her cooking fire for the last hour, wrapping them in rags, so they would still be warm by the time she came down off the mountain. She packed a small crock of mortar mix, the dry powder, just the powder, earth and ash and dried grass ground fine, ready to mix with water. She would not need much. She knew how much she would need. Silas Bowen watched her pack from the doorway. "I'll come with you, child." "No." "Hazel, you are 76 years old, Silas. You are not climbing back up this mountain in November if you come with me. Stay here. Tend the warm room. If I am not back in 7 days, send word down to Martha Jessup at the Crossroads store and tell her to look for me at my grandmother's house." He did not argue. He had learned somewhere in the 2.5 years he had known her that there were arguments with Hazel Whitaker that were worth having, and arguments that were not, and he could tell the difference now without having to test which kind he was in. "Be careful, child." "I will be. They will know you are coming back to town. By tonight, they will know." "I know they will, Silas. I'm counting on it." She came down out of the mountains the next morning, and she walked into Briar Hollow at 1 in the afternoon. And she walked up the muddy main street in plain daylight with the flour sack on her shoulder, and the hand axe in a sheath at her hip. And the people of that town stood on their porches and in the doorways of their shops and watched her come. The town looked smaller than she remembered, meaner, more fragile. The paint was peeling off the company store. 2 of the front windows of the post office were cracked and had been patched with cardboard. The road through the center of town was rutted and neglected. There were 3 houses on the lower end of the street that had been empty so long the porches had begun to sag. The last 3 years had not been kind to Briar Hollow. The men who had been young in 1937 had begun to leave, and the men who had stayed had grown older without being replaced. And the town was beginning to fold in on itself the way an old basket folds when the willow gets too dry. Hazel did not look at any of them. She walked the half-mile to her grandmother's rental house. She walked up the porch steps where she had stood 3 years before with the bolt sliding home behind her. And she opened the door and she went in. Vesta Whitaker was on the bed in the back room under every blanket in the house. and she was still shivering. The room smelled of cold ash and the wet, metallic smell that pneumonia leaves in the air. The fire in the front room was a thin, smoldering thing, and most of the smoke wasn't going up the chimney, but spilling out through the cracked flue into the front room itself, hanging in a gray haze near the ceiling. The two windows in the back bedroom had been stuffed with rags that had gone black at the edges with damp. The kerosene lamp on the bedside table was unlit because there was no kerosene in it. Hazel set the flour sack on the floor. She crossed to the bed. "Grandmother." Vesta's eyes opened. They were glassy. The fever in them was bad, very bad. For a long moment, she did not seem to recognize the face above her. Then something behind her eyes caught hold, and her dry, cracked lips moved. "Child, it's me. I'm here. You shouldn't have come back. Probably not. They'll do to you what they've been doing to me. They will not, grandmother. That is over. That is what I came to tell you." She unwrapped the warm stones from her flour sack. She slid them under the blankets along Vesta's body, one against the small of the back one at the feet, one against the ribs. The third stone was the warmest. She held it for a moment against her grandmother's bird-thin shoulder before tucking it in. "What is that?" Vesta whispered. "What is that, child? What is warm?" "Stones from a hot spring. I will tell you about it. I will tell you everything. But not now." She worked for 3 days and 3 nights. She did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch in that whole time. She built the fire up in the front room with seasoned wood. She fetched herself from the woodpile, and she sealed the cracks in the flue with the mortar she had brought down off the mountain mixed with water from the kitchen pump, working it into the splits with her bare fingers and waiting for it to set between courses the way she had learned to wait for it to set in the wall of her own cabin. She pulled the rags out of the windows and replaced them with proper patches and layers of canvas she begged from the dry goods store and clay. She dug from the bank of the creek and packed into the broken panes. She kept the warm stones rotating 3 in the fire and 3 under the blankets, never letting Vesta's body fall back into the cold for more than the few minutes it took to swap them out. She made broth from the dried beans and the smoked rabbit. She fed it to Vesta one slow spoonful at a time. She crushed the slippery elm bark in a cup of warm water and made the old woman drink it for her lungs. And the cough did not stop, but it began to loosen by the second night. And by the third morning, Vesta was bringing up the fluid in her chest in a way she had not been able to bring it up in 2 months. And the worst of the wet rattle had left her breathing. Word had spread, of course. Word always spreads in a town like Briar Hollow. By the second day, women were coming to the back door of the rental house. They came one at a time in 2s and 3s, carrying small things: a pint of milk, a handful of eggs, a loaf of bread, a small jar of honey from a hive somebody's husband kept on the back of his property. They did not stay. They left their offerings on the kitchen table, and they pressed Hazel's hand once, and they went out again the way they had come, quietly by the back, where the Crowders' eyes did not reach. Martha Jessup came on the 3rd afternoon. Hazel had known Martha would come. Martha was the wife of a brakeman on the Western Maryland line, and her own family had been one of the 3 across the ridge who had been trading with Hazel for the last 2 winters, sending up cornmeal and salt pork in exchange for seedlings and the things Hazel could grow that they could not. Martha was the keeper, more or less, of a quiet network of women in the 4 hollows around Briar Hollow that had been growing without anyone naming it for what it was. Martha did not come alone. She came with 8 women behind her. They stood in the front room of Vesta's house, all 9 of them, and they did not speak for a long time. They looked at the patched windows. They looked at the repaired flue which was drawing properly. Now white smoke rising clean up the chimney and out into the gray autumn sky. They looked at Vesta, who was sitting up against 3 pillows for the first time in 6 weeks, who was awake, who was watching them with eyes that were not yet bright, but were no longer glassy. Martha Jessup turned to Hazel. "He's coming, you know." "I know. He has been waiting 3 days. He wanted you to think you were going to make it. He wanted to see your face when he came through that door. That is what I expected he would do. What do you want us to do, Hazel? Stand where you are standing, Martha. That is all I am asking. Just stand where you are standing." Roland Crowder came at 4 o'clock that afternoon. He did not knock. He had never been a man who knocked. He pushed the front door open and walked into the room, and he was older than Hazel remembered, and heavier, and the small broken veins in his face had spread out from his nose into his cheeks, the way they spread on the faces of men who have been drinking earlier in the day for a long time. He was wearing the same kind of suit he had worn 3 years before, and he was holding the same kind of hat, and he had the same small, pale dishwater eyes, and they fixed on Hazel as soon as he came through the door. "Heard you were back." "I am back, Mr. Crowder. You are not welcome here. I am not here for you. I am here for my grandmother. When she is well enough to travel, I am taking her with me." "Travel where?" "You have nothing." "I have more than you think, Mr. Crowder." He took 2 steps into the room. He stopped. He had registered finally that there were 9 other women in the front room with them. He looked at Martha Jessup, who was standing just inside the door, with her arms folded across her chest. He looked at the women behind her. He looked at Esther Hollins, whose husband was a foreman in his own mine. He looked at Ruth Pendry, whose son had been killed in a roof fall in his number 3 shaft 8 years before, and had never been properly compensated. He looked at Pearl Anders, who had taught the Sunday school for 26 years, and at Cora May Sutton, whose late husband Roland had cheated out of 2 months' wages in 1933, and at 4 others, every one of them a woman who had taken care of her own family through the worst of the last decade by means Roland Crowder had never bothered to understand. "Get out of here," he said to them, "all of you. This is not your business." Nobody moved. "I said this is not your business, Pearl." "Cora, get out of this house." Roland, Pearl Anders said, "This is my business now." "It is mine too," said Esther Hollins. "And mine," said Ruth Pendry very quietly. Martha Jessup unfolded her arms. "She has been feeding our families for 2 winters, Roland. She has been giving away seeds. She has been teaching our girls how to grow things in January. You did not know that because none of us were ever going to tell you, because none of us trusted you with the knowledge of it. But she has been keeping us alive. And you are not going to put her out of this house today. You are not going to put her grandmother out either. Not while we are standing here." Roland Crowder looked from one of them to the next. His eyes were calculating in the small, mean way they had always calculated. He was a man who had spent his whole life measuring the cost of pushing further against people, and he had always pushed further, because the cost had always been low, because the people who might have stopped him had always been alone. They were not alone today. Today they were 9. He stood there in the middle of the front room with his hat in his hand for what felt like a long time, and was probably less than a minute. Then he turned. He walked out the door. He walked down the porch steps, and he did not look back. And the screen door slammed behind him with a sound that was not. And this time the closing of a coffin lid, but the closing of something else, something smaller. Something that had decided to stop pretending it was bigger than it was. Hazel carried her grandmother up the mountain trail 2 weeks later. Vesta could not walk the whole way. Hazel had known she would not be able to. She had built a kind of harness out of strips of canvas and a length of rope, and she carried the old woman on her back, and she stopped to rest every quarter mile, and she sang under her breath the small fragments of hymns she remembered from her mother's voice in the kitchen of a long-ago house. The trip took most of a day. By the time they reached the hollow, the sun was already dropping behind the western ridge, and the steam from the spring was rising thick and white in the cold air. And Silas Bowen was waiting at the entrance to the warm room with a small fire already going in the cooking pit, and a pot of broth already simmering. Vesta Whitaker, 68 years old, dying for the better part of 2 months, sat on a flat stone by the spring and looked at the underground cabin, and at the warm room behind it, and at the channels of warm water running where they had been taught to run. And she wept. "I'm sorry, child. You don't have to be sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. You did what you thought you had to do, and you did the only thing left that you could do, which was to tell me to go west. You saved my life, grandmother. You saved it the way you knew how. You sent me into the woods to live, and I lived." Vesta cried for a long time, the slow, tired tears of a woman who has not let herself cry for many years. Hazel sat beside her on the flat stone, and she put her arm around the old woman's shoulders, and she felt how thin those shoulders had become, and she watched the steam rise from the warm water in the basin and disappear into the gathering dark. Vesta lived another 11 years. She never fully recovered from that pneumonia. Her lungs were never strong again, but the warm, humid air of the hollow was kind to her in a way that the dry cold of the rental house had never been kind, and she got better than anyone had thought possible, and she did not get worse, and she became at last the grandmother she had been too frightened and too poor and too beaten down to be before. She helped in the warm room. She sorted seeds with her gnarled fingers. She told Hazel stories about her mother that Hazel had never heard. How her mother had loved to sing while she worked in the garden. How she had once grown a sunflower, taller than the porch roof. How she had said more than once that the best thing about plants was that they never judged you for who your parents were. Vesta died in the autumn of 1951, 82 years old, in the underground cabin where Hazel had first survived a winter alone. She died warm. She died holding her granddaughter's hand. Hazel buried her on the hillside above the spring in a spot where the geothermal heat kept the ground from freezing, even in the deepest cold, so that the earth would never be hard against her grandmother's bones. Silas Bowen had died 8 years before in the December of 1943. Hazel found him on a cold dawn morning sitting in the warm water of the spring, with his face turned up to the steam. His eyes closed, his expression so calm that for a moment she had thought he was sleeping. He had told her once that if he was ever lucky enough to choose, he would choose to go this way in this water on a morning when he had walked up the mountain by himself. He had been lucky. He had chosen. He had left Hazel everything. The hollow. The cabin he had lived in 4 miles down the slope. The small piece of bottom land he had owned along the creek. Everything was already in her name. He had transferred it 2 years before he died without telling her, because he had wanted her to feel that she had earned her place there, through her own work, rather than through his charity. She found the papers in a tin box on the kitchen table of his cabin the morning after his funeral, with a note in his blocky handwriting that said, "Only this was always going to be yours, child." Thomas Whitaker would have wanted it that way. She read that note 3 times before she understood what he was telling her. He had known her grandfather. He had told her that the first day they met. He had never told her in all the years that followed that her grandfather had been his closest friend in the world, and that the daughter of his closest friend's son had walked into his life on a Tuesday in March of 1938 and had given him a reason to keep climbing this mountain at the age of 74. She kept the note in her botany book for the rest of her life. In 1944, she married Thaddeus Ainsworth. He had come up the mountain with 3 other young men from a settlement 2 ridges over, looking to learn what she had built. Because the news of the warm rooms had spread by then through the small hollows of 4 counties, and the families that were copying the techniques had begun to send their sons and daughters to her to be taught. Most of them came and learned and went home. Thaddeus Ainsworth came and learned and stayed. He was a quiet man. He did not need to be told everything twice. He had a way of looking at a thing and understanding what it was for. They were married on a Saturday in May with Vesta watching from a chair Silas Bowen's old cabin had given her, and the 4 families from the surrounding ridges in attendance, and a Methodist circuit preacher from down in Marlinton who had ridden up the trail to do the service. Hazel and Thaddeus had 4 children. All of them learned to grow things before they learned to read, and all of them learned to read before most of the children in the county. Hazel insisted on books the way she insisted on compost as something essential to growth. She kept a notebook. She had kept one since the first winter. By the time she was 40, she had filled an entire shelf of them, and the techniques she had pioneered were being adapted and used in places she had never been, by people who did not know her name. A professor from West Virginia University came up the mountain in 1952, sent by an extension agent who had heard about the geothermal growing rooms, and he wrote a paper about what he had seen. Hazel read the paper when it was published in an agricultural journal a year later. She found 2 errors. She wrote a polite letter correcting both, and the professor described the letter in a story he told for the rest of his life as the most courteously devastating piece of correspondence he had ever received. Roland Crowder lost his store and most of his rental properties during the war. The young men who might have worked his mines went off in 1942 and did not all come back, and the ones who did come back had seen more of the world than Roland Crowder had ever wanted them to see, and they did not sign on at his shafts the way their fathers had. He drank more in the last years than he had in the years before, and he died alone in a back room of a boarding house in Marlinton in 1956, 68 years old. His eldest son, Edgar, long since moved to Cleveland, and the rest of his family scattered. Hazel sent flowers to his funeral, a small wreath of cut chrysanthemums from the warm room with a card that said, "Only from the hollow." Not everyone who saw the wreath understood it. She did not explain. She had not built her life so that people like Roland Crowder would understand it. She had built it so that people like Roland Crowder would no longer be able to reach into her life at all. She lived until 1997. She died at 76 in the house Thaddeus had built over the foundation of the original underground cabin, a house warmed by the same spring that had saved her life 60 years before. The hollow by then had become something of a quiet landmark, not on any tourist map. Known among the people who mattered, the people who grew things and taught others to grow things, and believed that knowledge shared was the only kind worth having. At her funeral, her oldest daughter read a passage from one of the early notebooks. The passage was simple, written in the careful slanted hand of a girl who had taught herself penmanship by candlelight in an underground room beside a hot spring in 1938. "The water did not care that I was 16, the passage said. The earth did not care that I was alone. The seeds did not care that nobody believed in me. They only needed warmth and water and time, and they grew. I think people are like that too if you give them the chance." Her oldest daughter folded the page and looked out at the small crowd of people who had walked up the trail to be there that afternoon. Among them were 3 grandchildren of women who had stood in Vesta Whitaker's front room on a gray afternoon in 1940. Among them were 2 great-grandchildren of Silas Bowen's brother who had heard the story of the hollow at their family table all their lives. Among them was an old woman in her 90s named Martha Jessup, who had come up the trail in a chair carried by her grandsons, and who was crying quietly into a folded handkerchief. The steam rose from the spring behind them in the November air. It rose the way it had risen every winter morning for 60 years, slow and patient and indifferent. It rose the way it had risen on the morning a 16-year-old girl with a flour sack and a botany book had come down off a rock shelf and put her cold hands into warm water for the first time. It was still rising. It rises still,